Now, as discussed in the previous slide, you see the formation of something called the Stamp Act Congress. And this Congress is going to be comprised of well-known leaders in the colonies. And what they're going to do is formulate an argument and put it forth before Parliament as to why the Stamp Act itself is indeed an illegal act, an illegal tax, that it's unjust, that it's coerced, that it's forced upon them. And basically, that is a violation of their English rights, right? It's taking away their property unjustly. Okay, so this is what we'll be unpacking. And you may have heard the slogan, no taxation without representation. It's a well known slogan affiliated with the American Revolution. And I put up another slogan, though, because it's less known, but it intersects closely with no taxation without representation. And that's the notion of taxation without consent. Okay. Keyword there, consent. Is it okay to tax the commoners without their consent? Now, it should be mentioned that in most monarchical systems stretching back to ancient times, that's exactly what's happening, right? Or even in the case of lords, right? Those who possess title to land, they tax the peasants, right? Who are squatting on the land, right? So, taxation without consent has been happening forever, but now you have a case where consent enters into the argument here. And that doesn't surprise us because we keep talking about the transition from feudalism to modern times. This notion of consent is central to more modern ways of government. Okay, so again, no taxation without consent, or even, taxation without representation. Both ideas, consent, that is, and representation, they intersect closely in this argument, and we're going to unpack it. And I'll argue that once we go through this argument, you'll understand the nature of this debate in a much deeper level. It's not simply that slogan, right? It actually has deep roots in the Anglo view, the English view of the relation of the common person with the monarch and how Parliament serves as an, if you will, intermediary institution between those two. It involves this idea of consent versus coercion, and coercion means, of course, by force, right? Okay, so this argument follows um, a specific trajectory here, and you can see it in front of you in the slide. Taxation itself is an economic issue. So it begins really with the economic debate, but then it evolves into a political debate and eventually becomes a philosophical debate when, many philosophical debates that are well known, it's hard to say who's really correct and who's wrong, right? In these strong philosophical debates. So basically, I'm kind of foreshadowing what happens. You arrive at an impasse at the end, right? With the philosophical dimension of the argument. Okay, so that's what we'll be doing. We'll be following the path of this argument. So we begin, however, before I discuss the economic debate, I want to discuss briefly the English view about taxation that's, you know, commonly and historically it's always happened, right? That's leveled towards commoners and, how commoners felt about that taxation. So this requires this English understanding of taxation as, quote, a free gift of the people, unquote. Okay. Now, this means that the idea of free here, free gift, doesn't mean free like you just give stuff away free. It means freely given, out of your own free will. Or another way to say that is you're not forced to do it. Okay. It is not coercive, to use our earlier term. Okay. So taxation, again, from the English perspective, those taxes leveled towards commoners was perceived ultimately as a, quote, freely given gift to the king. But here's how it was freely given. Okay. Again, you have the institution called Parliament. And Parliament, you might know this, has two houses. It has the House of Lords, and the House of Lords is considered the upper chamber, if you will. Just like we have the Senate and House of Representatives today, right? The Senate's considered more elite, if you will, than the House of Representatives. So similarly, you see that happening with Parliament. You see the House of Lords that in principle represents the lords, right? The aristocracy, nobility. And then you have in Parliament the House of Commons, right? And the House of Commons represents commoners, those below the nobility, and really the majority of English people, you know. So that's the House of Commons. So here is what happens when it came to issues regarding taxation. Let's say you have a monarch who wants to promulgate, wants to enact a particular new tax upon the common people. And you got to think again of the relation of the monarch over his or her subjects, right? Uh, in a literal sense, the monarch has the power of life and death over his subjects or her subjects, right? The king has absolute power, absolute authority. So, you could almost say that, hey, if the king wants to issue a new tax just to replenish his treasury, right, just to line his pockets, so to say, right, to get rich, right, personal wealth, well, that king has the absolute authority to do so. But in England, it's starting to become different now that you have the House of Commons instituted, which was, by the way, happened. The House of Commons, don't know the exact year, but it happens during the feudal era. Okay, and that, by the way, indicates the degree to which England was steps ahead from other countries that were mired in pure feudalism. Okay, but returning to this issue of taxation and the commoners, what happens by this time, and here we're talking about the 1700s, and certainly even before that, whenever there was a tax law about to be enacted by the king or queen, that law actually went first to the House of Commons. Okay, if it was a tax applied specifically to the commoners, the common folk, it first went to the House of Commons. And the House of Commons is comprised of representatives, right? They represent the common person. So they look at this tax and they come to the determination as to whether or not it is a just tax, whether it is a fair tax. As you can imagine, an unfair, unjust tax would be a tax that's levied upon the people simply to, you know, um, to again to add to the wealth or riches of the king. Right? It's almost at the king's whim. They feel like doing it, and they do it. But here's now in England, the House of Commons saying, "Wait a minute, this tax is for purely for the self-interest of the king. Therefore, we deem it as unjust." Okay, now it could be the case, however, that it is a just tax. For example, if you're about to become engaged in war, you need to raise money to subsidize this war, right? More weaponry, more soldiers or armies. Well, you need to raise taxes. So if it is a tax like that, then the House of Commons gets a hold of that tax proposal and they say, okay, this tax as applied to the commoners is indeed a just tax. So if the House of Commons again arrives at the determination this is a just tax, then that tax is valid. It will be levied upon the commoners. And moreover, and here's the important part, that tax scheme, specifically in relation to the subject and the king, and let's remember, like during this time, the king is seen really as a god on earth, nearly, right? As, not literally, but, almost, right? There was such a thing as the divine right of kings, which I'll talk about more. But basically, the divine right of kings, it was reason that the kings ruled because they were divinely appointed, by God to rule. Okay. So, there's this, really this relation of awe and respect that the subjects have towards kings, right? And you probably know that just by watching, shows like, Game of Thrones or those medieval shows, right? In any case, let's return to the House of Commons. Once the House of Commons deems it as a just tax, that tax is seen as a freely given gift. That's that important phrase that I just mentioned earlier. So take note of that. It's a freely given gift. Because why? The House of Commons has determined it to be a just tax. So as you can see, the House of Commons is an intermediary institution between the king and the commoner there, right? They're representatives of the common person, and the tax goes through them first, and they say, yes, it's a valid tax. So once it's validated by the House of Commons as a subject, as a commoner, as a loyal subject to the king or queen, you see that obligation to pay that tax as a gift, right? It's a freely given gift. In fact, you do it out of complete awe for the king, right? Complete loyalty to the king or queen. Okay. So, therefore, another way to say that is it is not coerced. It's a freely given gift. It is the tax that has been approved by the House of Commons should be seen as a freely given gift. It's not forced upon you. It's not coerced. You're not forced to do it. In fact, you do it out of love for the king, out of honor. Okay, so that's important to remember as we go through this debate. Just keep that in the background as we proceed. Okay, so let's begin now with the economic debate. Now, of course, you had the Stamp Act passed in 1765. It's an economic issue again. So here's the nature of the argument that the Stamp Act Congress is going to put forth. Okay, they're going to say, all right, Parliament, you just passed the Stamp Act, and we feel this is an unjust tax. So you can imagine Parliament saying, well, explain your position. The Stamp Act Congress, in response, they say this. Well, they set up a distinction between external versus internal taxation. Okay, now here's the distinction. According to the Stamp Act Congress, the taxes implemented from England to the colonial population are either external or internal. External refers to those taxes that are part of that transatlantic trade between the colonies and England, something we've talked about since the beginning of settlement, right? For example, sales tax, right? We know that the colonies are comprised of avid consumers of English finished goods. In fact, a lot of it is luxury goods, like we acknowledged. But they pay tax for that, just like a sales tax today you pay to the government, right? It's an indirect tax. It's involved with sales, right? And the colonials have always paid that. And they have no problem in principle paying external taxes. That's what the Congress is saying. But then what they're arguing, Stamp Act Congress that is saying, well, when it comes to the Stamp Act itself, that Grenville just passed, it is not an external tax. It is not associated with the transatlantic trade system, rather it's an internal taxation. That is to say, it's a direct tax imposed upon the colonial population. By the way, all 13 colonies were affected by this. Okay. And just recall what the Stamp Act was, right, with the previous slide. All right. It's the requirement of official documentation being printed on this paper sold by the English. All right. So again, that distinction is important because the Congress doesn't mind paying external taxes because they've always paid that, but the colonials refused to pay internal taxation. And indeed, that's what the Stamp Act is. They define it as a direct or internal tax. Okay, so that's very important to understand that distinction. That's the economic issue, but now it delves into a political matter because here's Parliament hearing Congress arguing and making this distinction between external and internal taxation. And they're going to say this, right? Basically, well, you are all subjects of the English Empire. As we explained to you, this empire is facing, economic dire straits. We need to do something about it, and that includes a tax hike. Now, I mentioned earlier that the colonial population was the most undertaxed population in the entire English Empire. In fact, one historian said they're the most undertaxed population in the entire modern world at that time. So that includes other European countries, right? Okay, so Parliament says this basically. You should really put aside your self-interest here and think about the empire as a whole. Think about common interest here, right? Think about the common interest of all English subjects, all right? All right, so that's their standpoint, Parliament, that is, right? So this delves into a political debate. And, the Congress is going to come back and say, well, listen, we will pay the tax, but the fact remains is that we don't have any representatives that attend these, meetings in the House of Commons in England, right, to determine whether it was indeed a just tax. The colonials have no representatives, and they are correct in that regard. Now, this, of course, is the slogan, no taxation without representation. So that's the colonial position. They're saying that, we can't object to these internal taxes because we have no representatives. We have no voice in Parliament. Okay, so again, now you could link it to taxation without representation, right? Another way to say this is this. Since we have no voice in the House of Commons, we have no representatives, well, we see this as an unjust tax. We have no representatives. Ultimately, for us, since there's no representation, this is not a freely given gift, quote unquote. In actual truth, it is something that's coerced upon us. It's imposed upon us against our will. And indeed, the corollary to all this is that it is unjust. It is illegal. It's taking away our freedoms. Okay, so this brings up another distinction. That's, again, the political dimension based on what I just described. The distinction between actual representation versus virtual representation. Now, actual representation is the standpoint held by the colonials. They're saying you need actual representatives in the House of Commons, right, in Parliament, in order to recognize any taxation, right? If we don't have any representatives, then ultimately we're being taxed without our consent. You need that person in there. But here is Parliament's response. Well, the fact remains is that you are all loyal subjects of the English Empire, and Parliament represents you. Okay, they represent every single English subject across the globe. Now, this is true when I say this empire is global in extent, because by this time, they're making headway into parts of Asia. India is now a colony. Certainly North America, but some Caribbean possessions. Right, so they have Asia, India, parts of um, you know parts of the world, and we talked about the 7 Years' War as being global, right? That shows the extent to which you see England as, quote, the empire where the sun never sets, unquote, right? To discuss how big it was. So when you look at that logistically, to use a modern term today, how can you have a representative from every corner of the globe to participate in the House of Commons in this very small corner of the globe called, you know, England, right? It's impossible to do that, especially back then. You didn't have jet planes and internet and instant communication, let alone telephones and telegraphs and what have you in the older times. No, it's all by ship, right? Transportation by ship. So that's a valid viewpoint, logistically speaking, when it comes to Parliament. Okay, but it's more of a principle. They're saying that Parliament represents all English subjects. And again, they keep pressing the point that the colonies are not thinking about the common interest of the empire where they should be, right? After all, they might add, right? You started the war, you colonials started the war in North America against our perennial foe, France, and this escalated into a full fledged global war that basically cost us all our money. And now you don't want to chip in and help out in recuperating the economy, right? Refuse to do so. But what is the viewpoint of the colonials when you really think about it at this point, putting aside, external versus internal, putting aside actual versus virtual? What they really desire is this: to return to the way it was before the 7 Years' War in terms of their relation with the mother country and with Parliament. That's ultimately what they want, right? To be left alone. It's almost like, thanks for helping us fight this war, but okay, let's return to the way things were before the 7 Years' War. Now, that's the political debate, and this delves into a philosophical one. Once you set up a distinction between actual versus virtual, and the role of Parliament, right, and its authority being questioned, that brings us to this question of sovereignty. Now, sovereignty in this case means authority, right? Like the sovereign king. He's the absolute authority. That's what it means. So this brings us to Parliament saying, again, we represent all English subjects. But then the Stamp Act Congress is going to argue that, well, actually, this is the case, that Parliament is representative of the people, and in fact, the people are more sovereign than Parliament, right? Because Parliament is basically just representing the people. We are the ones who put those people who are elected in those positions by our votes, and therefore we are really in charge. The people are in charge, not Parliament. Of course, Parliament argues otherwise, right? Parliament is the sovereign institution representing the entire global English empire. So again, as I mentioned earlier, this is a hard question to answer conclusively. In fact, even today in our government, if you ponder this question, such as, who is more sovereign in our country, the people or those elected officials in Congress and the Senate? All right. Uh, you can see how, in principle, we're supposed to be in charge. We, the people, right? We elect them, but we allow them to pass legislation by electing them. And once they're in office, they pass their legislation, right? And they are powerful. They're amongst the most powerful people in our country. They are sovereign, it seems. So even today, it's hard to answer that question, let alone back then. But you have to also recognize that we take for granted this debate as being a thorny issue. Back then, this is a new debate because of colonies abroad, right, comprised of English people, not of natives, like let's say in India, where you have natives as the majority, but of English settlers. Okay, so that's the debate. Now, what happens here at the conclusion of this crisis is that Parliament decides to repeal the Stamp Act. Okay, so that's a victory for the Stamp Act Congress. However, Parliament, in passing this, in repealing the Stamp Act, actually passes or issues something called the Declaratory Act. Okay, the Declaratory Act. And what does the Declaratory Act announce? It announces this basically, that Parliament has the right to legislate over all the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Okay, in all cases whatsoever. So when you think about it, this is what Parliament is doing during this whole debate and crisis. They're saying, okay, we will repeal the Stamp Act. But remember, in this philosophical debate about who is more sovereign, the fact remains is that Parliament is more sovereign. So don't forget that in the future. Okay? That's basically what that statement is saying. All right. So again, that's a victory for the colonials. In fact, they're going to celebrate this anniversary, right, of the Stamp Act victory every year during the colonial crisis, right, especially in Boston. And for a while, you're going to see relative peace and lack of tension until the next series of taxation is put forth, and that's called the Townshend duties, or the Townshend duties. So we'll talk about that next in the next video.